Nobody really noticed when the new kid walked into Westbrook High for the first time. It was the middle of October, and most students had already formed their friend groups. They had their lunch tables picked out, their spots in the hallway, their people, a new face showing up this late in the semester. That was just background noise. He was a thin boy, maybe 16 or 17, with dark hair that fell a little too long over his forehead. His clothes were clean but clearly worn. The kind of clothes that had been washed too many times. His backpack looked like it had seen better days, with one strap held together by a safety pin. He walked with his shoulders slightly hunched, like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. On his first day, he sat in the back corner of every classroom. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask questions. When teachers called on him, he gave short answers in a voice so quiet that people had to lean in just to hear him. Most kids didn't bother trying. They just shrugged and went back to their own conversations. Within a week, people had already made up their minds about him. He was the quiet kid, the shy one. Probably not very interesting. Maybe a little weird. Some students wondered if he even spoke English well. Though he did. He just chose not to speak much at all. What nobody knew was that this boy carried a whole world inside him that he never showed anyone. A world filled with music. His story actually began thousands of miles away, in a small apartment in the Philippines. That's where his grandmother lived. She was a tiny woman with silver hair and hands that looked fragile but could move across piano keys like water flowing over stones. Back in her younger days, she had been a concert pianist. She had played in grand halls, in front of hundreds of people, wearing beautiful gowns and receiving standing ovations. But life had taken many turns since then. By the time her grandson was born, she was just a quiet old woman living alone, with an old grand piano that took up half her living room. When the boy was just 4 years old, his parents sent him to stay with his grandmother for the summer. They were working multiple jobs and couldn't afford childcare. That summer changed everything. His grandmother saw something in him right away. The way he stared at the piano. The way his tiny fingers reached for the keys even before he could properly climb onto the bench. She started teaching him that very first week. Not with boring exercises or strict rules. No. She taught him the way she believed music should be learned. Through feeling, through story, through the heart. She would sit beside him and say things like, "This note here, it's not just a sound. It's a question. And this next one, that's the answer." She taught him that every piece of music was a conversation, a journey, an emotion that words could never quite capture. By the time he was 7, he could play pieces that most adults struggled with. By 10, he was performing at local events, small gatherings, and church functions. People would watch this small boy sit at a piano that seemed too big for him, and then they would hear the music that came out. It never failed to leave them speechless. His grandmother was his biggest fan. She recorded every performance on an old camera. She clipped every photo and pasted them into scrapbooks. She would hold his face in her wrinkled hands and tell him, "You have a gift. Never let anyone take it from you. Promise me." He always promised, but life doesn't care much about promises. When he was 13, his grandmother passed away. It happened suddenly, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone. The boy didn't cry at the funeral. He couldn't. It felt like something inside him had been switched off, like the music had died along with her. After that, things got harder. His family had always struggled with money, but now it got worse. His father lost his job. Bills piled up. They had to sell things just to keep the lights on. The first thing to go was the grand piano his grandmother had left them. He remembered watching 2 men carry it out of their home while his mother cried quietly in the kitchen. He wanted to scream. He wanted to grab onto it and never let go. But he didn't. He just stood there, frozen, watching his whole world disappear through the front door. For 2 years after that, he didn't touch a piano. Not once. It hurt too much. Every time he saw one, he thought of her. He thought of her hands, guiding his, her voice humming along as he played. The way she smiled when he hit a difficult passage perfectly. The memories were too heavy to carry, so he buried them deep inside and tried to forget. Then came the move. His father finally found work, but it was across the country. They packed up what little they had and drove for 3 days straight. New state, new city, new school, new life. When he walked into Westbrook High that October morning, he wasn't just the quiet new kid. He was a boy carrying grief he had never properly dealt with. A boy who had lost the one person who truly understood him. A boy who had once made music that could move people to tears but now couldn't even look at a piano without feeling his chest tighten. He told himself it was better this way. Better to stay invisible. Better to keep his head down, get through school, and not let anyone get close enough to ask questions he didn't want to answer. If people thought he was boring or strange, that was fine. At least they would leave him alone. But the universe has a funny way of pulling things out of us that we try to hide. There was a music room at the end of the east hallway. He passed it every day on his way to lunch. The door was usually closed, but sometimes it was left open just a crack. And through that crack, he could see it. An old, upright piano sitting in the corner. It wasn't grand or beautiful. Some of the keys were chipped, and the wood was scratched. But it was still a piano. Every time he walked past, he felt a pull. Like something was calling him. He would slow his steps just a little, peek through the crack, and then force himself to keep walking. He told himself he didn't need it anymore. He told himself that chapter of his life was over. But deep down, he knew the truth. The music had never really left him. It was still there, waiting. Like a fire that had been covered but never fully put out. All it needed was a single spark to bring it back to life. And that spark was coming sooner than he ever expected. 3 weeks had passed since he arrived at Westbrook High, and nothing much had changed. He still sat in the back of every class. He still ate lunch alone, usually outside on a bench near the parking lot where nobody bothered him. He still walked through the hallways like a ghost, unseen and unheard. But there was one class that made him nervous in a way the others didn't. Music appreciation. It was a required elective, and he had no choice but to take it. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, he walked into that room and felt his heart beat just a little faster. Because in the corner of that room sat the old upright piano, and every time he saw it, he had to fight the urge to walk over and touch the keys. The music teacher was an older man, probably in his late 50s, with a gray beard and kind eyes hidden behind round glasses. He wore the same brown sweater almost every day, and always carried a thermos of coffee that he sipped throughout the class. He wasn't strict like some of the other teachers. He didn't yell or give detentions. Instead, he talked about music like it was magic, like it was the most important thing in the world. The boy actually liked listening to him. The teacher would play old recordings of symphonies and explain what made them special. He would tell stories about composers who struggled and suffered but still created beauty that lasted for centuries. Sometimes, when the teacher spoke, the boy would close his eyes and let himself drift back to his grandmother's apartment. Back to the smell of jasmine tea and the sound of her humming while she cooked. But he never participated. He never raised his hand or answered questions. When the teacher looked his way, he would look down at his desk and pretend to take notes. He didn't want anyone to know, didn't want anyone to ask. The music inside him was his secret, and he planned to keep it that way. Then came the announcement that changed everything. It was a Wednesday, gray and cold outside, with rain tapping against the classroom windows. The teacher walked in with his usual thermos. But today, there was something different about him. He seemed excited. There was a little extra energy in his step as he set down his bag and turned to face the class. "All right, everyone," he said, clapping his hands together. "I have something special planned for the next 2 weeks." A few students groaned. Special usually meant extra work. The teacher smiled like he expected that reaction. "Don't worry, it's not a test. It's actually something I think you'll enjoy. Or at least, I hope you will." He walked over to the whiteboard and wrote 2 words in big letters: Performance Project. "Here's the deal," he continued. "Each of you is going to perform something for the class. It can be anything. Sing a song, play an instrument, Even just clap a rhythm if that's all you've got. I don't care how simple or how complicated it is. I just want you to try." The room buzzed with whispers. Some students looked nervous, others looked annoyed. A few of the more confident ones were already smirking, probably thinking about how they would show off. One kid near the front raised his hand. "What if we don't play any instruments? Then learn something basic," the teacher said. "I've got guitars, a keyboard, some percussion instruments. You have 2 weeks. That's plenty of time to learn a simple piece. And remember, I'm not grading you on skill. I'm grading you on effort and participation." Another student spoke up. "Do we have to do it in front of everyone?" "Yes," the teacher said firmly. "That's part of it. Music is meant to be shared. It's not about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to put yourself out there." The boy felt his stomach tighten. He stared down at his notebook, but the words on the page blurred. A performance. In front of the whole class. The thought made his palms sweat. For the rest of the period, the teacher went around the room asking each student what they planned to do. Some said guitar. A few said they would sing. One kid joked that he would play the triangle, and everyone laughed. Then the teacher's eyes landed on him. "What about you?" the teacher asked, his voice gentle. "Any ideas?" Every head in the room turned to look at him. He could feel their stares like heat on his skin. His mouth went dry. He wanted to say nothing. He wanted to shake his head and disappear into the floor. But before he could stop himself, a word slipped out. "Piano." It came out so quiet that the teacher leaned forward. "Sorry, what was that?" He swallowed hard. "Piano," he said again, just barely louder. "If that's okay." A few students exchanged glances. Some looked surprised, others snickered. The piano in the corner had been sitting there untouched for as long as anyone could remember. Most kids didn't even know if it still worked. The teacher, however, didn't laugh. He just nodded slowly, a curious look in his eyes. "Piano it is. Looking forward to it." And that was it. The moment passed, and the teacher moved on to the next student. But the boy's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. What had he just done? Why did he say that? He could have said anything. Could have said he'd play the tambourine or just clap along to a song. But no. He said piano. The word hung in the air long after class ended. For the next few days, he tried to convince himself he could back out. He could tell the teacher he changed his mind. He could pretend to be sick on the day of the performance. He could just take the bad grade and move on. But every time he walked past the music room, he felt that pull again. Stronger now. The piano was waiting for him. It had been waiting for 2 years. At night, he lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. He thought about his grandmother. About the promise he made her. About the music that used to flow through him like breathing. He flexed his fingers in the darkness, remembering how they used to move across the keys. Could he still do it? After all this time, or had he lost it forever? The question haunted him. On the Friday before performances were set to begin, he stayed after school. He told himself he was just going to look. Just going to sit at the piano for a minute and see how it felt. Nothing more. The music room was empty. The late afternoon sun came through the windows, casting long golden shadows across the floor. He walked slowly toward the piano, his footsteps echoing in the silence. When he reached it, he just stood there for a moment, staring at the keys. They were old and slightly yellowed. A few had small chips on the edges. But they were still there. Still waiting. He sat down on the bench. It creaked under his weight. He placed his hands on the keys, not pressing, just resting. The feeling was so familiar, it almost broke him. A wave of emotion rose in his chest, and for a second, he thought he might cry. Then, without thinking, he pressed a single note. The sound filled the room. It was slightly out of tune, but it didn't matter. It was still beautiful. Still real. He pressed another note, then another. And before he knew it, his fingers were moving on their own. A simple melody at first. Something his grandmother had taught him when he was 5. The music came back to him like an old friend returning home. He played for 10 minutes. Maybe more. He lost track of time. When he finally stopped, his hands were trembling. But for the first time in 2 years, he felt something he thought he had lost. He felt alive. He stood up, grabbed his backpack, and walked out of the room. His mind was spinning. His heart was racing. But somewhere deep inside, a decision had been made. He wasn't going to play something simple. He wasn't going to hold back. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it right. He was going to show them who he really was. The day of his performance arrived faster than he expected. It was a Thursday, and the sky outside was a flat gray. Like the world itself was holding its breath. He woke up that morning with a knot in his stomach that wouldn't go away. He barely touched his breakfast. His father asked if he was feeling okay, and he just nodded and said he was fine. He wasn't fine. The whole bus ride to school, he kept his headphones in but didn't play any music. He just stared out the window, watching the houses and trees blur past, thinking about what he was about to do. Part of him still wanted to back out. Part of him wanted to walk into that classroom and tell the teacher he had changed his mind, that he would rather fail the assignment than go through with this. But another part of him, a deeper part, knew he had to do it. Not for the grade, not for the teacher, not even for himself. He had to do it for her, for his grandmother, for the promise he made all those years ago. The morning classes dragged on forever. He couldn't focus on anything. Math problems blurred together. History lectures went in one ear and out the other. All he could think about was sixth period, music appreciation, the piano waiting in the corner. When lunch came, he didn't eat. He found an empty stairwell and sat on the steps, alone with his thoughts. He closed his eyes and pictured his grandmother's face, her warm smile, her gentle hands. He could almost hear her voice saying, "Music is how we speak when words fail us." He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Okay, I can do this." The bell rang. Sixth period. He walked into the music room and took his usual seat in the back. The classroom was buzzing with nervous energy. Today was the third day of performances, and about half the class had already gone. Most of them had been pretty basic. A few guitar chords here, a simple song there. One girl had sung a pop song, and while her voice cracked a few times, everyone clapped politely. The teacher praised each student for their effort, no matter how rough the performance was. Today, there were 5 more students scheduled to perform. He was the last one on the list. The first student went up and played a simple drum beat on the percussion set. It was nothing special, but the teacher nodded along and gave an encouraging smile. The second student strummed a guitar and sang a folk song, forgetting some of the words halfway through but pushing on anyway. The third student played chopsticks on the keyboard, which got a few laughs from the class. With each performance, his heart beat a little faster. His palms grew sweatier. He wiped them on his jeans over and over. But it didn't help. The fourth student finished, and then the teacher looked down at his clipboard. "All right," he said. "Last one for today." He looked up, and his eyes found the boy in the back of the room. "You're up." For a moment, he couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of stone. The whole class turned to look at him, and he could see it in their faces. Curiosity, doubt, a few smirks. They were expecting nothing, just another forgettable performance from the quiet kid who never spoke. He stood up slowly. His chair scraped against the floor, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. He walked toward the front, each step feeling like it took an hour. When he reached the piano, he stopped and just looked at it. The old upright, chipped keys, scratched wood. It wasn't the grand piano from his grandmother's apartment. It wasn't beautiful or elegant. But right now, it was everything. He sat down on the bench. It creaked, just like before. He placed his hands on the keys and took a deep breath. Behind him, he could hear students shifting in their seats. Someone whispered something, and a few people chuckled quietly. He closed his eyes. For a moment, the whole world fell away. The classroom, the students, the whispers, all of it disappeared. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw his grandmother. She was sitting beside him, just like she used to. Her hand rested gently on his shoulder. Her voice was soft and warm. "Play for me," she said. "Play like no one is watching." He opened his eyes, and then he began. The first notes were soft, gentle, like raindrops falling on a quiet pond. A few students leaned forward slightly, not sure what they were hearing. The teacher, who had been sipping his coffee, slowly lowered his thermos. Then the music grew. It swelled and rose, filling every corner of the room. His fingers moved across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. The notes cascaded like waterfalls, climbed like mountains, whispered like secrets, and roared like thunder. He was playing one of the most difficult pieces in classical piano. A piece that professional musicians spent years trying to master. A piece full of emotion, complexity, and raw power. And he was playing it perfectly. The classroom went completely silent. Not the bored silence of students waiting for something to end. This was different. This was the silence of people who couldn't believe what they were seeing and hearing. One girl in the front row had her mouth hanging open. A boy near the window had frozen mid-text, his phone still in his hand, completely forgotten. The kid who always made jokes and never took anything seriously was sitting perfectly still, his eyes wide. The teacher had set down his coffee and was staring at the boy with an expression that was hard to read. Shock. Wonder. Something close to awe. The music kept building. It told a story without words. A story of loss and longing. Of memories that never fade. Of love that survives even death. Every note carried weight. Every chord had meaning. Somewhere in the middle of the piece, something unexpected happened. A girl sitting near the front, the one who always seemed so tough and put together, quietly started to cry. She didn't make a sound. The tears just rolled down her cheeks as she listened. She couldn't explain why. The music just reached inside her and touched something she didn't even know was there. She wasn't the only one. A few other students wiped their eyes, trying to be subtle about it. Even the class clown, the one who had joked about playing the triangle, sat completely still, with a look on his face that no one had ever seen before. The boy at the piano didn't see any of this. His eyes were closed again. He wasn't in the classroom anymore. He was back in his grandmother's apartment. He was 7 years old, sitting beside her on the bench, listening to her play this exact piece. He remembered how it made him feel, how he had asked her to teach it to him, and how she had laughed and said, "One day, when you're ready." Now, he was ready. The final section of the piece arrived. The music grew louder, more intense. His hands flew across the keys, hitting every note with perfect timing. The sound filled the room, filled his chest, filled his soul. It was like releasing something that had been trapped inside him for years. And then, the final notes. He held them, letting them ring out, letting them echo off the walls, and fade slowly into silence. When he finally lifted his hands from the keys, the room was completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. For a long moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Then the teacher stood up. He didn't say anything. He just started clapping. Slow at first. One clap. Then another. A student in the front row joined in. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire class was on their feet, clapping, cheering. Some of them were still crying. The applause was thunderous, filling the room with a sound almost as powerful as the music that had come before it. The boy finally opened his eyes and turned around. He looked at his classmates, at their faces full of shock and admiration. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. And somewhere far away, he was sure his grandmother was smiling. The applause seemed to go on forever. He sat there on the piano bench, his hands still trembling, not sure what to do. He had spent so long being invisible that he didn't know how to handle being seen. The sound of clapping and cheering washed over him like a wave, and for a moment, he felt like he might drown in it. When the noise finally started to die down, the teacher walked over to him. The older man's eyes were red around the edges. like he had been holding back tears. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder and just looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Then, quietly, he said, "That was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard in this classroom. In 30 years of teaching, I've never—" He paused, his voice catching slightly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The boy swallowed hard. "My grandmother," he said. "She taught me." "Back in the Philippines," the teacher nodded slowly, like that answer made perfect sense. "She must have been an incredible woman." She was. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. But nobody moved. Students were still staring at him, whispering to each other, some of them wiping their eyes. The teacher had to actually tell everyone to pack up and head to their next class. Even then, people lingered, glancing back at the boy as they walked out the door. He gathered his things slowly, hoping to be the last one out so he wouldn't have to face anyone. But when he stepped into the hallway, a small group of students was waiting for him. The girl who had cried during his performance was standing there. She looked almost embarrassed, clutching her books to her chest. "Hey," she said softly. "I just wanted to say, that was really amazing. I don't even know why I cried. It hit me. You know?" He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "Thank you." Another student, a tall boy who sat near the window, stepped forward. "Dude, how long have you been playing? That was insane. Like, actually insane. Since I was 4. He said quietly. 4? The tall boy's eyes went wide. "And you've just been sitting in the back of class this whole time? Not saying anything? Bro, you're like a secret genius or something." "Not." The boy felt his face getting hot. He wasn't used to this. Wasn't used to people looking at him with admiration instead of indifference. He mumbled something about needing to get to his next class and slipped away through the crowd. But that was only the beginning. By the end of the day, everyone in school seemed to know what had happened. Someone had recorded his performance on their phone, and the video was already spreading through group chats and social media. He heard whispers in the hallways as he walked past. "That's him. Did you see the video? I can't believe that quiet kid can play like that." People who had never spoken to him before suddenly wanted to talk. They stopped him in the hallway, asked him questions, told him how amazing his performance was. A girl from his math class, who had sat next to him for weeks without saying a single word, suddenly wanted to know everything about him. Where was he from? How long had he been playing? Did he take lessons? Could he teach her? It was overwhelming. He had spent so long trying to disappear, and now it felt like the whole world was looking at him. Part of him wanted to run away and hide. Part of him wanted to go back to being invisible, but another part of him, a small but growing part, felt something different, something warm, like maybe being seen wasn't such a bad thing after all. That evening, when he got home, his father was sitting at the kitchen table going through bills. He looked tired, like he always did these days. The move had been hard on everyone, and his father worked long hours just to keep them afloat. "How was school?" his father asked without looking up. The boy hesitated. He hadn't told his father about the performance. Hadn't told him he was playing piano again. For a moment, he thought about just saying fine and going to his room. That's what he would have done a week ago. But today felt different. "I played piano," he said quietly. "At school. In front of my class." His father looked up, surprised. "You did?" "Yeah, for a music project. I played one of Grandma's pieces." His father was quiet for a long moment. The boy could see emotions moving across his face. Pain, pride, sadness, memory. It had been so long since either of them had talked about her. The loss was still too fresh. Even after 2 years, they had both learned to avoid the subject, to work around the hole she had left in their lives. Finally, his father stood up and walked over to him. He put his hands on his son's shoulders and looked him in the eyes. "She would have been so proud of you," he said, his voice thick. "So proud." The boy felt tears sting his eyes. He tried to hold them back, but he couldn't. They spilled over and ran down his cheeks. His father pulled him into a hug, and they stood there in the kitchen, holding on to each other, finally letting themselves feel the grief they had been carrying for so long. "I miss her," the boy whispered. "I know," his father said. "I miss her too." They stayed like that for a while, not saying anything else. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. The next morning, when he arrived at school, he found out that the video of his performance had gone beyond just the students. The school's official social media page had shared it. The principal had seen it, and the head of the music department, a woman who ran the school's orchestra and choir programs, wanted to meet with him. He sat in her office during lunch, nervous and unsure. She was a serious-looking woman with short gray hair and sharp eyes. On her desk was a framed photo of a symphony orchestra, and behind her was a shelf filled with trophies and awards. "I watched your video this morning," she said, folding her hands on the desk. "I've watched it 5 times, actually. I had to make sure I wasn't imagining things." He didn't know what to say. So he just sat there and waited. "That piece you played," she continued, "is one of the most difficult works in the entire classical piano repertoire. Professional musicians train for years to play it at that level, and you performed it in a high school music class like it was nothing." She leaned forward. "How is that possible?" He told her about his grandmother, about the summers spent learning at her side, about the years of practice, the recitals, the love of music that had been planted in him before he could even read. He told her about losing his grandmother, losing the piano, losing himself for 2 years. And he told her about finding his way back. When he finished, the woman sat back in her chair and studied him for a long moment. "There's a summer conservatory program," she said finally. "It's highly competitive. Students from all over the country apply, and only a few get in. They offer full scholarships to exceptional young musicians." She paused. "I'd like to recommend you for it." His heart stopped. "Me?" "Yes, you. I've been running the music program at this school for 15 years, and I've never seen raw talent like yours. It would be a crime to let it go to waste." She picked up a pen and began writing something on a notepad. "Think about it. Talk to your father. If you're interested, come see me next week, and we'll start the application process." He walked out of her office in a daze. A scholarship, a conservatory program, a chance to study music seriously, to develop his gift, to become something more than the quiet kid in the back of the class. A week ago, he had been invisible. A ghost drifting through the hallways with his head down and his heart closed off. Now, everything was different. He thought about his grandmother again, about the promise he made her, about the music that had been sleeping inside him for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to wake up. Maybe this was that moment. Maybe this was the beginning of something he couldn't even imagine yet. For the first time in a long time, he let himself feel something he had almost forgotten: hope. The weeks that followed changed everything. The boy who had once been invisible was now someone people knew. They smiled at him in the hallways. They saved him a seat at lunch. They asked about his music, his grandmother, his story. It was strange at first, uncomfortable even. But slowly, he started to get used to it. Slowly, he started to open up. He met with the music director several times to work on his application for the summer conservatory program. She helped him record a proper audition video, using the school's best piano in the auditorium instead of the old upright in the classroom. She wrote him a glowing recommendation letter. She believed in him in a way that reminded him of his grandmother, and that meant more to him than he could ever explain. His father helped too. In the evenings, after work, they would sit together at the kitchen table and fill out forms, gather documents, and talk about the future. It was the most they had talked in years. The silence that had built up between them after his grandmother's death was finally starting to break apart. One night, while they were working on the application, his father got up and went to the closet in the hallway. He came back carrying a small cardboard box that the boy had never seen before. It was dusty and taped shut, like it had been packed away for a long time. "What's that?" the boy asked. His father set the box on the table and carefully opened it. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a few small items wrapped in cloth. The boy's breath caught in his throat when he realized what he was looking at. His grandmother's things, the things they had kept when they sold the piano and moved away. His father pulled out a photograph and handed it to him. It showed a young woman in a beautiful dress, standing on a stage next to a grand piano. She was smiling, her eyes bright with joy. It was his grandmother, decades ago, after one of her concerts. "I never showed you these," his father said quietly. "After she passed, it was too hard. I packed them away and tried not to think about them. But I think she would want you to have them now." The boy held the photograph with trembling hands. He traced the outline of her face with his finger, remembering her voice, her laugh, the way she hummed while she cooked. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of old silk, was something else. A small medal on a faded ribbon. He unwrapped it carefully and looked at the inscription. It was an award his grandmother had won at a national piano competition when she was just 18 years old. "She won this the year before she met your grandfather," his father explained. "She always said it was one of the proudest moments of her life. She told me once that she hoped someone in the family would follow in her footsteps someday." He looked at his son with tears in his eyes. "I think she was talking about you." The boy couldn't speak. He just held the medal in his hands and let the tears fall. A few weeks later, the news came. He had been accepted into the summer conservatory program. Full scholarship. When the email arrived, he read it 3 times, just to make sure it was real. His father hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. For the first time in years, he heard his father laugh. Really laugh. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. But there was one more thing he had to do before the school year ended. One more performance. The winter concert was held in the school auditorium in December. It was a big event, with students from the choir, orchestra, and band all performing. Parents filled the seats. Teachers lined the walls. The whole community came out to watch. The music director had asked him to be the closing act. At first, he wasn't sure. The idea of performing in front of hundreds of people terrified him. But then he thought about his grandmother. He thought about everything she had given him. And he knew he had to do it. Not for himself, for her. The night of the concert, he waited backstage while the other students performed. His heart was pounding. His palms were sweaty. But he felt strangely calm underneath it all. He had done this before. He could do it again. When his name was announced, he walked out onto the stage. The auditorium was packed. Hundreds of faces looked up at him from the darkness. The stage lights were bright and warm on his skin, and there, in the front row, was his father. He was holding something in his hands, a framed photograph. The boy couldn't see it clearly from the stage, but he knew what it was. His grandmother. His father had brought her to watch. He sat down at the grand piano. It was beautiful, polished and gleaming under the lights. So different from the old upright in the music classroom. So different from the piano in his grandmother's apartment. But when he placed his hands on the keys, it felt exactly the same. He closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, and he began to play. The piece he chose was different from the one he had played in class. This one was softer, more personal. It was a piece his grandmother had written herself, years ago. When she was young and full of dreams, she had never published it or performed it for anyone except him. It was her gift to him, passed down in those summer afternoons when the world was small and simple and full of music. The melody floated through the auditorium like a whisper. It spoke of love, of loss, of memories that never fade. It spoke of a grandmother and her grandson, sitting side by side on a piano bench, sharing something that words could never capture. People in the audience began to cry. They didn't know the story behind the music, but they felt it. They felt every note, every pause, every breath. Music has a way of speaking directly to the heart. bypassing all the walls we build around ourselves. And this music was speaking louder than anything they had ever heard. When the final note faded into silence, no one moved. The auditorium was completely still. Then, slowly, his father stood up. He was crying openly, not trying to hide it. He began to clap. One by one, others joined him. The applause grew and grew until it filled the entire room. People rose to their feet. A standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. The boy sat at the piano, tears streaming down his face, and smiled. He looked at his father in the front row, holding that photograph. He thought about his grandmother, wherever she was now. He thought about all the years of silence, the pain, the grief, the fear of being seen. And he thought about how far he had come. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was exactly who he was meant to be, a musician, a storyteller. His grandmother's legacy, alive and breathing, and making music that moved people to tears. As he stood up and took a bow, he whispered something under his breath, something only he could hear. "I kept my promise, Grandma. I kept my promise." And somewhere, in a place beyond sight and sound, he knew she was listening. He knew she was proud.